Welcome, everyone. We are happy to have you here with us tonight for this event, Troops in the Nation's Capital, 1 year later. We are going to get started after a few logistical directions. We are thrilled to have you here with us tonight. Please note that we have closed captioning available for this event. To see captions, click the CC button on the bottom of your screen and then click Show Subtitles. I want to welcome back our translator, Liz, and have her provide instructions for using our translation feature.
Thank you, Monica. Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Liz Torres y estoy aquí con la Cooperativa Comunitaria del Lenguaje. Gracias por su compromiso con la justicia lingüística, que así todos puedan escuchar en el idioma de su corazón. El día de hoy tendremos interpretación en español y para tener acceso usted puede presionar al menú de más y ahí seleccionar inglés o español. Si usted necesita ayuda, por favor, tome en cuenta que el chat no está habilitado y podrá tener acceso en la QIA, en la cajita de QIA. Hi, good evening. My name is Liz Torres, and I am here with the Community Language Cooperative. And today I will be your interpreter so that we can have some language justice and everyone can hear in the language of their heart. So we will turn on interpretation, and at that time, you will be able to select it through the globe icon at the bottom of your screen, or if you're on a smaller screen, you can select it through the More menu and select English or Spanish from there. We also have closed captioning in English and Spanish. If you have any trouble, please note that the chat has been disabled, and you can access anything through the Q&A questions. And we can go ahead and get interpretation started.
Thank you so much, Liz. We also want to note that this space is intended for ACLU volunteers and supporters. If you are press in attendance and want more info, please contact us at media@aclu.org. Again, I want to thank you for being here. My name is Monica Hopkins, and I'm the Executive Director of the ACLU of the District of Columbia. 1 year ago today, President Trump announced he was deploying National Guard troops to patrol the streets of Washington, D.C. We were told it was temporary. We were told it was an emergency. But tonight, I want to talk about what that year has actually looked like. Here's what a year of the presence looks like in numbers. Over 4,000 National Guard troops pulled from 15 states and the district have patrolled our streets. The federal government has spent $292 million just on lodging. That is enough to house up to 2,000 National Guard troops in apartment-style units here in D.C. And despite a lawsuit, despite protests from D.C. residents, despite our own local elected leaders saying this needs to stop, the Pentagon confirmed last month that troops will continue to patrol our nation's capital until the end of the president's term in January 2029. Let that sink in. Not months more, years more. When these troops arrived, DC was in the middle of a reported crime decrease. There was no emergency then, and there is no emergency now. National Guard troops should be deployed for real emergencies, like natural disasters. They should not be a political prop, and they should not be a permanent fixture anywhere in America. Instead, this deployment is costing taxpayers roughly $3 million a day to keep armed troops in the streets of DC. I want to be direct about why this happened here in the first place. Washington, D.C. is not a state. We don't have control over our own National Guard. That makes us an easy target, a place where federal administration can test how far it can push to expand its power and shrink local democratic power without the same guardrails that would stop it in Texas or in California. That is not an accident. That is the point. DC has become a testing ground for anti-democratic tactics that this administration has said openly it intends to use nationwide. We went from 800 National Guard troops in DC when they were first deployed last year to over 4,000 National Guard troops today. What happens here does not stay here. Some governors have already done the right thing and brought their Guard members home. Every governor who still has troops deployed here should do the same. I want us all to remember we cannot become numb to the presence of the National Guard in Washington, D.C., or begin to treat it as routine. It is not normal to have residents see National Guard members on their way to work to see their family or go to something like a local Spirit soccer game. It is not normal to have military trained personnel deployed in our communities. And it's important that we continue to examine what it means for the people who live here and for our democracy. We also need Congress to act. We need the country to pay attention, and we need DC to finally become the 51st state so that people who live and work here have the same protections against federal overreach that every other American takes for granted. Our local democracy, and frankly, our national democracy, depends on it. So, you're going to hear tonight from our legal director, Scott Michelman, about the legal implications of ongoing National Guard troop presence in our community. You will also hear from Mike Zamore from our national office about what's happening here in DC and how that connects to a much bigger picture of abuse of power and federal overreach. We will also hear from ACLU-D.C. client Sam O'Hara, whose peaceful protest playing the Imperial March music from Star Wars while walking behind Guard troops led to his own unlawful detention. After this panel discussion, please put your questions in the Q&A box by pressing the More button at the bottom of the screen where you'll see the Q&A logo. Our team will be monitoring as many questions as possible during the Q&A, but the chat will be disabled, so please do put those questions in the Q&A box. So tonight, I want us to move past the headlines and into what this year has actually meant, legally, nationally, and personally. So please join me in welcoming our panel, Scott Michelman, Mike Zamore, and Sam O'Hara. Scott, I am wondering, I'm going to kick the first question to you. Could you talk about what our community has seen as a result of the National Guard deployment? And what are the implications of the ongoing deployment for the accountability of law enforcement?
Sure. Thanks, Monica, and thanks for highlighting this huge problem. We have seen National Guard troops everywhere throughout the District of Columbia on our way to work, on our way to take our kids to schools or to the museums or to the mall or to spirit games. It's disconcerting, it's unnerving, and it goes against a fundamental tradition we have in this country of civilian law enforcement. So it's no wonder that brave protesters like Sam O'Hara, who we'll hear from later in this program, wanted to do something and protest that. Because in addition to wasting taxpayer dollars, in addition to unnerving us on our street corners, there is a fundamental problem of accountability that this raises. And it does that in two ways. One is democratic accountability. Most policing in this country is local, as it should be. Now, we've had our problems with the Metropolitan Police Department of DC, and we've sued them many times, but they are ultimately accountable to the people of DC, to the voters of DC, through the mayor of DC, because their police chief reports to the mayor, can be removed, and can be subject to oversight by the DC residents' elected representatives in the DC Council. But that's not true of National Guard troops from all over the country. That's not true when National Guard troops hail from Idaho and Ohio and other states whose governors the people of DC had no role in electing. And it's also not in any meaningful sense true of the DC National Guard, which reports in a federal chain of command. We don't have a vote in Congress, and so we can't exercise oversight powers as the residents of the District of Columbia. And so the normal chain of democratic accountability running from the voters to their elected leaders to the people who are doing law enforcement on the street is broken. The second type of accountability that troubles me here is the lack of judicial accountability. And that's because when federal troops, and that includes DC National Guard, and we've seen tons of just straight federal officers here in DC as well during these deployments, when they violate our rights, we can't sue them like we can state or local officers. That's because the Supreme Court has demolished piece by piece the legal doctrine that lets ordinary people come into court and sue federal officers when their rights are violated. And so, to take a concrete example, the same violation of rights committed by the DC police or by the DC National Guard would be treated very differently by the courts, even if the actions were just the same and just as unconstitutional when they occurred. Without accountability, our rights are just words on paper. And so having federal and DC National Guard troops roaming the city is an invitation for abuse without judicial accountability. And those are two ways in which we, the people of DC, and everyone who visits DC, is less safe than we would be with ordinary local policing. I think you're on mute, Monica.
After all these years.
After all these years, it still happens all
It
of our
still
meetings.
happens. So, I mean, for those who are listening who may not be from DC, the clarity of, the deployment of troops here, is unlike other places because we do not have statehood. And so even our National Guard is under the authority of the president. And so it is very different than other states, even with the barrier of not deploying their National Guards or their national troops in the way that our own National Guard was deployed against the city residents here in DC.
That's right. It would be unthinkable for a state to see other states' National Guard called in to police its people without the consent of its governors. Now, National Guard go to real emergencies, natural disasters all the time at the invitation of the elected leaders who are calling for help. That's not what happened here. The president decided that for his own political reasons, he was going to deploy troops in DC because he could. And because of DC's vulnerability, because we're not a state, we were one of the first places to see National Guard deployed. And with the latest announcement about 2029, we're going to be one of the last places where they remain. There's no reason for that. As you said, Monica, crime was going down when this happened. And the presence of the Guard has not decreased violent crime. Even beyond the effects on the crime rate itself, ordinary crime is not an emergency. Crime rises and falls. And to this point in our history, we've done pretty well with local policing. We should not turn ordinary crime or other regular events into excuses to unleash military or military-like force against Americans.
I have to keep reminding myself this is not normal.
This is not.
This is not normal. And to have National Guard troops stay here until 2029 it's not normal. It shouldn't be normal, and it's unnecessary. Thank you so much, Scott. I'd actually like to turn to Sam, who, thought this is not normal and wanted to say something about it. Hey, Sam.
Hey,
Uh,
Monica.
Welcome. I have to say, Sam, um, your protest sort of caught fire. I think I play the Imperial March in my head now every time I see National
Great.
Guard troops on our street. But can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to protest the National Guard troops, particularly in the way that you did?
Sure. Yeah, and thanks for having me. I think, to accurately describe my mindset, you have to imagine what this felt like a year ago today. It was beautiful summer in DC. I live in DuPont Circle, which is a gorgeous neighborhood. If anyone's on this call that has never been to DC before, DuPont Circle is one of our fabulous neighborhoods. There's many of them, but my neighborhood is filled with beautiful row homes and young parents pushing strollers and cute cafes and coffee shops and great bars. And there's an incredible, vibrant LGBT scene here. It's just like a fantastic place to live. Um, so when I started seeing troops with weapons standing in front of my coffee shops, in the park where I walk my dog, on the corner where I had a kiss with a boy on a date, just like it started feeling like I was living in this is an Avatar: The Last Airbender reference, but Bossing Say, for anyone who knows. It felt like I was living in this like surreal dystopian world. And it really kind of came to a head. I was taking my dog Lincoln. He's an 11-year-old rescue from City Dog here in DC, and I was taking him for a cute little walk one morning and was going to get croissants at the local bakery. And there was three men dressed, National Guard uniform, patrolling DuPont Circle, which is redundant to say, but a circle. And they were just walking in circles around as if we were in some kind of war zone. And the scene just struck me as hilarious because it could not be a nicer area. And I think there was a golden doodle somewhere to my right. It just is like it just felt like I was living in this Twilight Zone, if you will. And the idea kind of just popped into my head that, I envision these troops as troopers, as stormtroopers. And, I pay way too much money monthly to have a subscription to Spotify, but I opened up my Spotify and started playing the Imperial March sound and recording them. Originally, it was kind of meant to be tongue in cheek to be shared between friends, but the video went viral and my protest started working.
Yeah, and so can you tell us what led up to you actually filing a lawsuit? Because I know it did kind of go viral and it tapped into something that I think a lot of DC residents were feeling about the absurdity, but it was more than just like your protest also ended in you filing a suit. So can you tell us what happened that led to that?
Yeah. I mean, the weeks after my original form of protests, the original filming of the National Guard, I started a TikTok called Free DC 20009, which is the zip code here. And I started recording more and more. Anytime that I would run into National Guard, I would start recording and protesting. And that was no different on a bike home one day from work. I came along, maybe a group of six, I can't recall the exact number now, but National Guard standing on the corner outside of Red Light Pizza where my friends and I would go after a night out. And they were standing there and I started recording them. And one of the officers did not find levity in what I was doing and decided to call the police. The MPD showed up, and within moments, I was in handcuffs and detained. My First Amendment rights were, stripped away from me very quickly, and I was held there for, anywhere between 15 to 20 minutes. while I asked them, why am I being detained? Am I free to go? And was not getting a straight answer. Um, Eventually I was let go after being handcuffed and, forcibly stopped from protesting. And that's when I decided to reach out to the ACLU of DC um, through Instagram. I sent them a DM and, before waiting to hear back from them the next day, I went downtown to the offices and tried to walk in the front door, which I found out quickly that's not that's not
It's
possible.
not how we take intake.
That's not how it works. But the very kind person was like, you can fill out a form online, and I did that, and one thing led to another, and all of a sudden I had representation, and it was a nonprofit at work, so it was incredible to see.
And I think there is something, about that act that can be chilling, right? Like sort of this act of protest and then the response to that of,
Oh yeah.
calling the police and being handcuffed. And so what would you say to other DC residents, or others who want to speak out but are nervous about what might happen to them, especially in this sort of environment where we're seeing more and more people speak out and, be in places where there are National Guard troops or other law enforcement?
Totally, and that's a very fair question. I think the word brave was used to describe me earlier. Scott, thanks very much for saying that, but I would not call myself brave. I would just say that I'm well informed. I pay attention, I know my rights, and I think having that information has empowered me to know, what is my right as a protester? How far does free speech go? I knew that I was on a public sidewalk, so I'm free to protest in the way that I choose, see fit, and that knowledge is empowering. I think that with knowledge comes, that freedom to know that what you're doing isn't against the law. So I think if I even questioned it for a minute, that wouldn't be here, and this case wouldn't have gone as far as it did. But I felt fully in my rights, and that empowered me. The last thing I'll say about just bravery and protests is that DC as a whole, the city was built by people that feel passionately about politics and government, and I hope that people that have a strong feeling about anything continue to protest because it's the backbone of America, and it's our freedom.
I like to say that's why the First Amendment is first, right?
I love that. It's
So
corny, but I love that.
yeah, but I also really appreciate what you're saying about knowledge is power, and knowing your rights is so important. And I really, really appreciate, not only the levity you brought to your form of protest, but that you stood up for protest in these moments. So thank you so much, Sam.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I'm gonna switch to Mike now. Mike, if you want to jump on with us. Uh, I'd like to kind of zoom out, and think about how DC, this year fit into sort of this bigger national pattern.
Yeah, thanks. So what's happening here in DC is in some ways a very unique to DC kind of story. And as Monica, as you've talked about, it's a it's a colony of the federal government effectively, right? We don't have our own, we don't have statehood, we don't have our own power here. So and I say we because I'm a 26-year resident of the district. So we've had a year of the guard on our streets without our consent, um, because we don't have representation in Congress. The government can impose its will on the people of DC. And in other states, we have seen the administration try to send the National Guard and to effectively send the National Guard into other states. Initially, they were in Los Angeles and Chicago. They tried to send them to Portland, Oregon as well. And eventually, because they were basically trying to use the state's own National Guard against the wishes of those blue states, The case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that they were overstepping the statutory authorization of the provision they were trying to do this under. In DC, we don't have that option. So here is a little bit different. However, I really want to emphasize that this is very much a national story. And it's a national story because, like you've talked about, Monica, and Scott did as well, and Sam, like clearly the deployment is a pretext, right? This wasn't really about crime. It wasn't really about America 250, although ironically, one of the grievances in the Declaration of Independence was that troops were being quartered in the cities of America without the consent of the governed. Um, the real purpose here was exactly what happened to Sam, right? It's to quell dissent. It's to try to show people that there's a consequence for opposing the administration and to intimidate. It's a power grab. So, in that respect, it is really of a piece with so many other things we've seen all across the country. So the weaponized prosecutions against people for touching the reflecting pool water, or for putting seashells on a beach, or for having the temerity to not agree with the policy positions of this president, or to criticize the president, or to tell the troops that they don't have an obligation to follow illegal orders. Like all of these things have been prosecuted by this administration because they're going after their opposition and their enemies. They've used the FCC to target broadcasters for their criticisms of the administration. DHS is surveilling and harassing protesters. They've even, they're wielding our taxpayer dollars to punish their opponents, or people who disagree with them, and to reward their cronies and their supporters. All of this is about the administration and their enablers trying to use federal power to enrich themselves and satisfy the whims of their leader, and to avoid democratic accountability for doing so. And so this is, what's happening in DC is really not limited to DC. And what I love about Sam's story, and Sam, we haven't met before, but I am certainly a one of the many people who consumed your TikTok with joy when you were first going up with it. I think what's so important is that we are collectively pushing back on each of these efforts to weaponize the government in order to sort of steal the power that is supposed to belong to us, to serve all of us, rather than the cabal who happens to be holding power at the moment. And so, the lessons that we have from backsliding democracies elsewhere is that you have to fight on every front. And that's why I'm so grateful that we've got people from all over the country on this Zoom right now, focused on this issue. And I'm sure we've got plenty of DC folks here too. Go DMV. But I think that this really is important that we all be responding every time the administration is trying to weaponize its power to silence its opponents, to punish those who disagree, and hoard power for themselves. And every time that we beat them back, every time they have to retreat, it's a victory for team democracy, and it brings us a little bit closer to the U-turn that we are hopefully going to execute.
So I agree wholeheartedly. And it's oftentimes really hard. I'm glad that there are folks from across the country on this Zoom, sort of learning about what is unique about DC, even though we're seeing it as part of a picture of what is happening. And of course, I'm a DC resident also, and so I feel, a particular way about this, but we are the capital city also. We are where, Congress and the federal government does its business. And for an administration who has shown authoritarian power grabs to flood the city with troops in an attempt to normalize it is really sort of like the canary in the coal mine. So, what should we be watching for here, Mike, when we say, we're in the coal mine, but like big picture, like what should we be watching for going forward?
Well, I think that we need to be vigilant for certainly the deployment of the National Guard or active duty military, but also, I mean, the explosion of paramilitary style kind of unaccountable law enforcement under the guise of immigration is, a huge concern. I just saw a story while we were waiting to go live on this thing. I saw a story come across that DHS is talking about giving ICE agents gloves that can deliver a shock as a means of controlling people, crowd control. I mean, this is like dystopian stuff. And I think that it's really important as we, right now, I'll say first of all, like, you've talked about this so eloquently, Monica, but normalization is deadly in this context and when you're fighting for democracy, right? The authoritarian leaders around the world and people here as well are, they're counting on fatigue and futility and fear to get people to just relent and allow them to keep stealing more and more of the resources and power that are supposed to belong and work for all of us. And so the when people like Sam say, "Oh hell no, we're going to draw attention to this," and then if they come after us, we're going to fight back. It's really important, and I think that we are heading into election season. ACLU's number one, two, and three priorities at the moment are safeguarding this election. We know that there's going to be potential threats that they are trying to avoid democratic accountability, and we are determined and have very extensive plans along with many, many of our partners to ensure that everybody gets a chance to cast their vote and those votes count. And the people who win that election ultimately take power. So that's, this is a moment when, I think we all recognize we're building towards an inflection point potentially. Like, we can start the Democratic U-turn in November if we can put people who actually will stand up for democracy in office. And so I think one of the things that is on a lot of people's minds right now is will they deploy the National Guard? Will they deploy ICE in ways that try to intimidate and stop people from voting? One of the things I loved about what Sam said, sorry to keep name checking you, Sam, but it's good stuff, is that he talked about knowing his rights. And I think that we're doing Know Your Rights trainings with tens of thousands of people to make sure people understand the limits. So it is illegal. It's a violation of federal law for armed men, I think is the terminology in the law, to be at the polling place, right? So we can't, they can't send the National Guard, they can't send armed ICE soldiers into polling places. But we know that there's going to be all kinds of potential harms, and so one of the things that we are really building towards is mustering the people power that we know is here on this call, and it's we've got 6 million people who are supporters of the ACLU, and we want to get as many of those people as possible, and others to try to be the shock troops that kind of help us stand up for our rights, defend the integrity of our election, defend our First Amendment rights, use that people power to push back and avoid that normalization and show that as many resources as they have, like it is fragile. Like the grip on power they have is fragile when we have the mass of people standing up for the rights and freedom that we are entitled to. So that's I think that we, as we go into this next season, like we have to all be vigilant and recognize that it's this is a team sport here to make sure that we have the rights that we deserve.
I know which team sport you and I might really like.
It's one of the most important team sports next to soccer.
Yeah. So, and I really want to connect what you said about like knowing your rights. We'll name check Sam one more time, but also, Scott said at the very beginning, that government should be accountable to the people. And were put in place by the people. A little bit different for DC here, but we need to remember that, and that's the importance of standing up for our rights here. So I want to thank everyone again for sharing their story and expertise with us. Because of the volume of participants, we will not be using the chat to answer questions, but our team has been monitoring and collecting questions throughout the discussion, and we will do our best to get through as many as we can in the time that we have remaining. So if I could have all participants come on screen, I think we'll have some Q&As that we've pulled from the Q&As. So Scott, I'm gonna start with you. Uh, do we know what the stated mission is of the National Guard? This person is asking, I see the Guard every day, a lot of us do, and they are almost always merely standing around in the shade. It's hot here in DC, talking with each other. For example, troops are stationed in front of the National Gallery East building, which is probably one of the safest places in the city. So do you know the stated mission of the National Guard, or what is the National Guard for?
Well, usually we think of the National Guard as to be a force for domestic assistance in natural disasters, and we've seen them play that role many times over the decade. You can think of, National Guard members assisting in Hurricane Katrina. We've also seen National Guard used as a supplement to the regular military, and National Guard members have, fought bravely and valiantly alongside our regular military forces in conflicts over the last few decades too. What they are not is law enforcement. That's not their mission. That's also not their training. And so to take it back to Sam's story, a very concrete example is that local police here in DC, they screw it up sometimes, but they know they have in their policies that folks have the right to record law enforcement in the performance of their duties. And they were so aware that they screwed up that they actually settled the part of the case that we brought on Sam's behalf against them. That is the DC police, because they knew they screwed up. This is against their policy, and we do not generally see the violations of the right to record so frequently as we have over the past year. Because guess what? The National Guard troops are not trained to police civilians, and so one of the things they're not trained on is First Amendment rights, and so they are violating folks' right to record. We've also seen, when you talk about mission and mission creep, the government filed a declaration in DC's lawsuit against it about the limits that the government had put on the National Guard and their mission. They're not supposed to be engaging in certain types of law enforcement. They're on the terms of their own mission, they're just supposed to be, at most detaining people so that local police can arrive. We've seen massive mission creep there, and we've seen the Guard engaging in all kinds of enforcement actions that are quite troubling and in some cases violate folks' rights.
So and maybe this is a question for you, Mike. What states still, or Scott, what states still have National Guard stationed in DC? And then I think maybe the second part for Mike, how can states be contacted to get the Guard out of DC? So Scott, do you have a sense of, I think
I don't have the numbers here in front of me, although our fantastic tech team, shout out to our fantastic tech team, is going to provide that information. So it's a wide variety of states. And but that does not have to be the case. The governors have control of their own guards, and because this is not a situation where the Guard has been called into active duty military status, federal military status. It is what courts have referred to as a hybrid status, where the state governors retain control. And so the state governors can say, we are done with this sprawling, undefined, unnecessary, mostly political mission. We're going to bring our brave National Guard folks home to their families and their communities and stop policing yours. That is a choice that the governors can make of these states. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mike to talk about how to send that message.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, as you can see, it's a pretty long list, and I will note that some of these states, based on my conversations with random Guard members, some of them have been sort of told to come here by their National Guard. It's just a deployment that they were assigned, but many of them chose to come. And it's interesting because, I think for many of the individual Guard members, it's either, chance to see the world. They get to come to DC and have all expenses paid trip. I think they're getting pretty well paid. And
Hang out in Sam's neighborhood.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So, standing around a metro station, whatever, isn't like the most scintillating, but you get to spend 6 months or 3 months, whatever you are, like wandering DC. It's, you could do worse. So I think it's interesting because I think it points out that there's like potentially two leverage points here. One is the governors, but the other is the National Guard members themselves. And, I think it is, I don't know how many of them understand or appreciate, based on my conversations, I think many of them don't understand that like they are not really wanted here. They're being told DC has a ton of crime. We're going to clean it up. We're doing something, they think they're doing something righteous. That's what they're being told. They're being fed a lot of propaganda. And so I think it's important to both send the message to the governors of these states, but also to, there has to be I think a broader understanding that this is, directly contrary to what it is supposed to be American, right? Like you're not supposed to be facing, soldiers in camouflage wandering your streets against your will. And there's, nobody in DC chose this. None of our elected representatives chose this. This is exactly what the American Revolution is all about, folks. So, in terms of getting in touch with states, if you are from one of these states on this list, definitely urge you to contact your representative, your senator, the governor, and do that outreach. And of course, also touch base with your local ACLU affiliate, and they would be happy to also give you other ways to help get involved.
So it's a both and is what I'm hearing, because these National Guard troops wouldn't be able to choose to come to DC unless the governors actually said, yes, we're going to send troops.
Yeah.
It's sort of like at the top, we're going to send troops. Who wants to go? But also since they are here, sort of confronting the myth busting, right? Like that they're not wanted in DC. There is not an emergency or a necessity for them to be here. And it is the federal administration calling out troops, calling out the National Guard to police civilians in DC. And that's not wanted. Scott, you talked about how part of Sam's, case was settled, and maybe this is a question for you, and maybe it's a question for Sam, but like, where's the case right now, and like, what is next?
So the case continues against the Ohio National Guardsmen who sort of set the whole thing in motion by calling the local police to put Sam in handcuffs and detain him for his protest. That case continues. They have moved to dismiss. We have vigorously opposed, and we're waiting on the court to rule. And we're going to continue this fight because it's vital to the First Amendment and to show that in some cases there can be accountability. Now, I mentioned before the difficulties of holding federal troops and DC National Guard accountable, but we're in a slightly better position when it comes to state guard troops. And so in this case, it is slightly easier to hold the National Guard who initiated Sam's arrest accountable because he was from Ohio. And that's yet another reason that the governors should want to get their National Guards people home, because they can be sued and exposed to legal liability when they're in situations that they're just not trained for. That is, ordinary local policing. That is the job for ordinary local police. And Sam, I'll shut up now in case you want to add anything about your case.
Yeah,
how
and
exciting.
Sam, I kind of wanted to know, like, what does this partial settlement mean to you, and how are you feeling about the next steps?
Um, I mean, Scott, I think you nailed it. That we continue, and hopefully we prevail with Ohio. But I think the settlement, you know, part of the settlement makes me feel great. That at some level, fault has been admitted. At another level, where does this money come from? From DC taxpayers. So that at that level, it feels not so great. We don't want them here, and this is now affecting DC as a whole. Uh, the Metropolitan Police Department made a big mistake putting me in handcuffs, and I'm thrilled that they have paid for that mistake. But this shouldn't be. We shouldn't be in this position to begin with.
So I like the, hopefully we will prevail. We like prevailing, especially on things that we know are your First Amendment rights. Um, we have a question about what should people know when we witness Guard members, you know, confronting a person in DC? What rights do we have? Scott?
So I will begin with the standard lawyerly disclaimer that this is general legal information, not legal advice specific to any person on this call and their specific circumstances. But in general, I will say the First Amendment does protect, and it's been established by courts across the country that the First Amendment protects people's ability to witness and observe and film the activities of law enforcement in public places. And so people can exercise that right. That has been a very powerful tool of accountability, and we've seen it particularly in the last 10 years, from the video of George Floyd's tragic murder to some of the more recent abuses by federal immigration agents in Minneapolis, in Maine, in Houston, and also some of the abuses that we've witnessed right here. I mean, and Sam's own experience. Even non-fatal abuses are still abuses that are important to document and important to hold people accountable. When we do that, um, when we rise up and take control of of telling the story of what's actually happening, people will stand with us. And we've seen huge swings in public opinion against this administration and its authoritarian tactics that have led to important reversals. And the withdrawal from Minneapolis and the closing of Alligator Alcatraz earlier this summer are just two examples in which people fighting back, exercising their rights peacefully and lawfully, sometimes through the courts, sometimes with their voices and in other ways, have really affected policy. I should end with a caveat, again, as general information. The right to record does not extend to interfering with the activities of law enforcement. So you can people can document their activities and record them, but not in a manner that interferes. And so it is important to be a reasonable distance away. And for folks' safety, of course, if they're ordered further back, it's always safest to comply. Unfortunately, there's no, it's not like a sporting event where there's an umpire right there. There's no judge on the street to say, oh, that's too far. You can't appeal in the moment. So always safest to comply, but recording without interfering is a constitutional right.
And I will just do, the plug that we do have Know Your Rights information available on our website, on the National ACLU's website. I think what Sam pointed out of like, it's really important to sort of know your rights and have that information. So when things do happen in the moment that, or before you're going out to protest or demonstrate, what those lines are, so you can make choices for yourself.
Monica, if I could just add one other um, moment about the power of recording and video. I think all of us were shocked when we saw the violent dispersal of the civil rights demonstrators at Lafayette Square here in Washington, D.C., in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. We are still fighting for accountability for those folks who came together across races, across generations to peacefully sing and chant and call for justice and protest law enforcement abuses, and in particular, violence against people of color. And were met, um, despite the absence of provocation, despite the absence of even of any reason, with overwhelming force, tear gas, a baton charge, rubber bullets. We are still fighting for those folks. And part of the reason why that incident captured the national attention, it prompted hearings in Congress the way it did, is because it was so well documented, both by journalists and by folks on the ground who witnessed it and experienced it.
So protecting that right, the right to actually film and record it, is an important right to protect as well. I would be remiss to not ask this question that someone has asked, because we are in DC. We are in a city that was known as Chocolate City. And so could someone speak to the specific harms that Black and Brown communities in DC are experiencing due to the National Guard?
So one thing that I think is very important to understand is the National Guard is one piece of the federal surge here, and another piece is ICE. ICE has been terrorizing our immigrant communities, and one of the ways in which we have been fighting back is there has been a slew of warrantless arrests without probable cause in violation of federal law. We represent people who were basically racially profiled. They were pulled over for no discernible reason other than that they had brown skin or that they were otherwise suspected of being an immigrant. We represent people who were told, even after showing documents, that they were going to be arrested, that they attempted to show documents, and that was rebuffed. They were told they were being arrested just because there was a quota to meet. And that conduct is unacceptable. Now it's related to the National Guard in that it's the further sort of federalization of law enforcement here in the district, that the pruning away of local control and the centralizing of federal control either in the federal government or in the authorities of other states that the people of DC don't vote for. So that's another way in which Washingtonians' rights are being violated, particularly the communities of color. And so we've stepped up and sued to stop that practice of warrantless arrests without probable cause, and obtained both an injunction and a subsequent order to enforce that injunction that has really brought the number of warrantless arrests in the district down. So we do see some success in that area, but the fight is definitely not over. We are monitoring to make sure that the injunction is being complied with, and we are continuing to receive reports and respond to reports from immigrants here in the district.
And Monica, as the other thing I would just note is, I had mentioned earlier that Guard was deployed in a number of blue states and that practice has ended. The Guard's also been deployed under the authority of the governors in several red states into majority Black cities, Memphis and New Orleans in particular. There's also deployment I believe there's another place I think anyway. But but the point being that there is a racial component here that is impossible to miss when the language that the administration uses about crime is so obviously coded and racial, and when the Guard is being deployed against the wishes of local leaders by state governors in states where the political control is in a different party. There's parallels, and I think we have to have to understand what is happening with the National Guard in the context of everything else that is happening with this administration to essentially erase the civil rights movement.
I think that's a good sort of 60,000 foot view, and remembering that calling out the National Guard here, and then it was Chicago. These are majority minority cities where crime is code for a majority minority city. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. And I also want to, for folks who aren't from DC, I'm so glad you raised, Scott, this sort of federalization of sort of law enforcement, for lack of a better term, here in DC. I was at a metro station where, a young man was being detained, and there were National Guard troops standing by. There were Metro police. It was sort of a really ridiculous number of law enforcement, National Guard. And then my friends turned to me and said, wait, are those actual FBI? Because the FBI was there. So on our streets, we're not only seeing the National Guard, we are seeing other forces that are in communities as well. I didn't know that the IRS actually has law enforcement officials, saw them at a metro station recently. So this federalization, this attempt to normalize is something that a year in, we need to remind ourselves is a grab for power, and also call for its end, or find ways to joyfully protest and stand up against this administration. Folks who live outside, the last question, because I think it's a great one, is like, what can people do who don't live in DC to support the end to this? And so I think in the chat, I'm looking to my guide is a link where people can sign on to have any troops either not come to DC or be removed from DC. And so you can click that link, sign on, and take action there. And we will keep working and fighting here in DC. So I really want to thank you, Scott, Mike, and Sam, for sharing your expertise, your perspective, and your experiences with us tonight. I want to thank everyone who joined us for this important conversation. Over the course of this conversation, we have heard about the legal consequences of the National Guard here in DC, the deployment here in DC, the broader national implications, and the real impact it has had on members of our community. 1 year later, thousands of National Guard troops remain on the streets of Washington, D.C., with plans to continue this deployment for years to come. But if there's one thing that I hope everyone takes away tonight, it's this. We cannot allow ourselves to accept this as normal. We also need people across the country to support DC statehood. The lack of statehood is what makes DC uniquely vulnerable to this kind of federal overreach. So you can click that link in the chat or scan the QR code on your screen to send a message to Congress. You can tell them that DC deserves statehood, that the continued National Guard presence in our city must end, and that the federal government should stop interfering in DC's local affairs. The people of the district deserve the same democratic rights, representation, and ability to govern themselves as every other American. Thank you again for joining us tonight. Thank you for your support and defense of democracy, and have a really great evening. And take care.